Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan. This is Super Review, and this is the Dunu Zen PRO. So you might remember that just earlier this year I reviewed the original Dunu Zen. I think it was back in February. And they're already back here now with a Pro model, which it's actually a little bit more expensive, as you might suggest from the name. This is a $900 single dynamic driver earphone, just to set the stage. But yeah, this is the follow-up to the original Zen. And you got to be thinking, all right, apart from the name Pro, what changes? What are the differences here? So I'll start just with a little bit of background on the things that are similar to the original Zen. So first of all, the Zen Pro, like the last one, is using Dunu's house-made dynamic driver. They call it an Eclipse driver, and that is one thing that actually makes Dunu kind of unique in the chi-fi space, is that they actually manufacture their own dynamic drivers. A lot of manufacturers, you don't know this, but a lot of manufacturers use kind of off-the-shelf parts and tune them to their own applications. But Dunu, they actually make their own, which is pretty cool. So that's what's similar. Obviously, the shape, if you're familiar with the original Zen Pro, or sorry, the original Zen, and I'll pull it in a bit. The shape, the body, the shell, the chassis, all this stuff is basically the same as the original. There is a little bit of a difference in the coloration here. They do have a new finish. But apart from that, the real differences are honestly in the accessories package, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and it's not that different, but the bigger differences are going to be in the tuning. And if I'm perfectly honest, you can pull this up on squig.link right now if you're curious to check it out and compare the Zen versus the Zen Pro in terms of their tuning. You'll notice they're actually fairly small changes in the frequency response differences. But I do think that they add up to a significantly different sound that I think is worth checking out. So that's what we're going to talk about in this review. Like all my other reviews, this is a live stream, so if you're watching now live, you have any questions about the Dunu Zen Pro, leave them in the live chat. At the end of the review, we'll have a little back and forth conversation. Otherwise, I guess shout out to Dunu for sending this in for review, and let's jump to the table and start talking about what comes inside the box of the Zen Pro. And, well, this is what you get inside the box. It's fairly typical for Dunu and pretty decent accessory package, I gotta say. So for starters, they come with this case. This is the same case that came with the original Dunu Zen. One of my favorite IM cases, actually. It's got a nice zipper on it. It opens here. It's got a little bit of a webbing, so it kind of holds it at a set size. I actually really quite like this Dunu case. One of the few accessory cases that I actually use. So there you go. You got that going for it. It's not an actual real leather. Wait, let me smell it real quick. I don't know. It didn't smell bad at all, but I don't think that's a real leather. But it is definitely quite nicely made. Apart from that, you do get, of course, quite the selection of ear tips. I've just pulled out like one sample of each, and I guess we can zoom in on these real quickly so you can take a look. But you basically get 3 different styles of silicone ear tips. This style right here is kind of like a Sony hybrid clone, which is a really nice, soft, gummy silicone. It's a little thin, a little stretchy. I like that. This one is a little bit, well, it's actually quite a bit thicker, quite a bit harder, but maybe more of a rounded shape. And then this one's kind of like an Acoustune ear tip, so somewhere in between those two in terms of stiffness and grip levels. And then they do also include a set of these foam ear tips, which curiously have a little bit of a plastic pattern on the inside. I'm not totally sure what that's about, but there you go. Those are the 4 different tips at your disposal. And then apart from that, well, you notice I do have these little pieces here, which is going to lead me into talking about the cable. It does come with, of course, one of Dunu's patented quick lock. I forget the actual branding that they use for these cables, but they've got a Dunu cable, which if you haven't seen these before in the past, Dunu makes some of the nicest cables in the IEM game, and this cable, I would say, is no exception. This is a different cable, however, than the one that came with the original Dunu Zen. In fact, I can pull that cable in for comparison. The one that came with the original Dunu Zen is this guy right here. I guess some people complain about it being a little bit too thick. I didn't mind the thickness here, but the one that comes here with the Zen Pro is a little bit on the thinner side. Maybe a little bit easier to handle, but otherwise, frankly, just as functional and just as nice. So punch in on that so you can take a look at it up close. But what I wanted to talk about is just this. This is the thing that makes Dunu cables especially nice, is the swappable termination. So right here I've got a 3.5 millimeter standard connector, but if I want to, I can just pull this sleeve down, pull that thing off, pull in one of these other terminations, and now I've got a balanced 4.4 millimeter connector on my Dunu Zen Pro. And I think that's pretty slick. I really do like that Dunu does this for their nicer IEMs. I'm not much of a balance person, so like for me, it doesn't actually make that big of a difference because I'm totally happy with your standard 3.5 millimeter. But I know a lot of people, you know, you're spending a lot of money on an IEM. It's nice to not have to worry about that. So that's the cable. What else to say about it? I mean, look, it handles nicely. I'll show you that it roadie wraps quite nicely. And it's got a relatively small Y-split. It's got a functional chin cinch, which maybe is not the most attractive, just kind of a simple plastic piece, but it does the trick. And then it terminates up here into MMCX connectors. If I had one complaint about this cable, and this is a thing I've mentioned to Dunu a couple of times, but if I had one complaint about this cable, it's just that I wish that they printed the L and R indicators on the inside of the MMCX cable rather than on the outside. I don't know. I think it just kind of spoils the aesthetic a little bit, and it would look a little bit nicer if it wasn't out there. Otherwise, that's the cable. So let's talk about the earpieces themselves, which you can see here. And like I mentioned earlier, these are essentially the same design as the original Dunu Zen. We pull those things in for comparison. The one difference you'll notice is that the original Dunu Zen came in sort of a really dark black color, and then here you've got an updated gunmetal gray. I don't really have a strong preference in terms of the aesthetic of these two, but I do like how this one melds with the cable. I think that's a pretty nice look. Otherwise, these earpieces are basically the same, which is to say, as far as dynamic driver earpieces go, these are actually some of the better ones. They're relatively small, which I don't know if that's coming across. I mean, this is a very large dynamic driver that's in here, but they have managed to keep the shell itself actually quite small, which I appreciate, and that contributes to a fit that I think is a little bit better than your average dynamic driver. Now, it's still not as secure fitting as, you know, like a semi-custom molded earphone that you might get with like a Moondrop Blessing, Moondrop S8, Thea Audio, stuff like that. But as far as dynamic driver ones go, look, this one fits into my ear quite well. And it actually stays in place better than most. I think partly because of how small it is, and you can kind of see it tucks in here behind, what do we call this, the tragus, something like that, some part of the ear. But yeah, generally, you know, it plugs in and is relatively unobtrusive. The one thing I will point out is that the edges around here are a little bit on the sharp side. I mean, they're not like carved sharp or anything like that. You can just kind of see that it comes to a point rather than being rounded. And I do find that over time, I can find this to be a little bit irritating in the back of my concha. But I don't know. Honestly, I generally found these to be very, very nice to wear. The one thing you might notice is that I'm not actually using any of the stock ear tips here on the Dunu Zen, and there's nothing wrong with the stock ear tips. In fact, I stuck with the stock ear tips on the original Zen when I reviewed that, and I think I was fine with those. But these are just Moondrop's new spring tips, and I like these quite a bit, and they work really well here on the Dunu Zen Pro. Let me check my notes real quick, but I think that's probably, yep, that is entirely all that I've got to say about the physical aspects of the Zen Pro. So what do I think about the sound? And like I was kind of describing up front, the frequency response here in the Zen Pro is very similar to what you will see on the original Zen, or at least on paper, right? You'll notice there are some differences, but it's really interesting to listen to them in back-to-back comparisons and really see just how much those small differences, how big of a change they actually make. So we'll just start by talking about the general sound signature here on the Zen Pro, and then I'll pull in I got a handful of other IEMs that we'll talk about for direct comparisons afterward. But the general sound signature here in the Zen Pro, so the original I would kind of describe as a bit of a mild V-shaped sound signature. This one, I think this is basically a neutral sound signature. It does have a little bit of mid-bass warmth and body added on top of it, so this is not like a lean, boring neutral. It does have a little bit of a bass boost in it, but for the most part, this comes across much more of a mid-range focused sound signature. The bass is, again, there is a little bit of emphasis here, but again, versus the original Zen, the bass is definitely less dominant here. The upper mid range has been subtly retuned. Again, that's something you can see in the frequency response. But I think probably the bigger difference is going to be in the treble response, where the original Zen was kind of known for having somewhat of a dark treble presentation. They've done a pretty good job of bringing out the treble extension, I think, to a more expected amount. So the treble here is actually quite nice. I would say this no longer sounds anywhere close to dark. I wouldn't say this is a bright sounding earphone either. So while I'm describing this as sort of neutral with bass boost, like, don't get in your mind that this is sort of a lean, bright, forward sounding earphone. The tune here is just honestly like it's a fairly relaxed version of neutral with a nice sense of bass. Still got a little bit of mid bassiness to it. But for the most part, this really is a lot more focused on the mid-range quality than the original Zen was. So that's the general sound signature. Let's talk about what are the things that I like about this. And honestly, just up front, the tuning, I think on this thing is frankly pretty phenomenal. And this is a thing that will kind of come across if you look at it again on squig.link. The frequency response here almost to a T lines up with my preferred tuning. Just kind of my target response. There is definitely more bass, so this, it's a little bit warmer than my exact preference, but honestly, as far as dynamic drivers go, there are not a lot of dynamic drivers that are tuned that close to my target, and this is definitely one of the better ones, so I really quite like it. I do think that just purely in terms of tonality, this is a very clear improvement in my mind over the original Zen. I would say this is, again, where I was describing the original Zen as kind of more mild V-shaped, it's a little bit stronger in sort of the macro contrast. I think that the Zen Pro does a lot better with the micro contrast, which just gives you an improved sense of detail, an improved sense of texture. That comes across a lot in vocals and guitars and stuff like that. I would say it's maybe that difference and that advantage is less obvious in electronic music, where the notes are maybe a little bit more smoothed over, where with more acoustic music, where there's a little bit more of that texture, and again, sort of that micro contrast in the presentation is where I think the Zen Pro really excels. And then the bass quantity that's here, I honestly find pretty satisfying. Again, it's a little bit more bass than I would typically like for my ideal sound signature, but it's not like smeary. It doesn't bloat up the mid range or anything like that. Like it's a nice bass presentation. So pretty happy with that. So then I guess we can talk about the things that I don't love about the sound here on the Zen Pro. And if I'm perfectly honest, there's not much to talk about in this segment. I mean, if I'm being really picky, I could say the treble could sometimes be a tad on the wispy side. It's a pretty minor complaint, honestly, but where the original Zen was a little bit on the dark side. Again, I wouldn't say this is a bright sounding earphone, but there are a couple of times when the treble can sound just a smidge on the spicy side. Interestingly, when I listened to a pre-production version of the Zen Pro earlier this year, I actually found that added treble presence made it sibilant. But interestingly, here with the production model, I had zero issues with sibilance. So I'm bringing it up now just in case there's some variation out there. But in my experience with this model right here, honestly, surprisingly, no issue with sibilance or anything like that. I would say the biggest trade-off here with the Zen Pro versus the original Zen is the bass character, okay? This is a very solid bass character, right? I have no complaints about the bass character here. Maybe doesn't have quite the definition of some of the best bass characters out there, but more to the point, the original Zen had a really, I'm gonna call it a special sense of bass. Like the bass presentation on the original Zen is the reason to get the original Zen. And I do think that's a little bit sacrificed here with the Zen Pro. So the difference is really gonna come down to, do you want that really kind of standout, unique bass character, or do you want a better all-around, well-rounded, tuned earphone? Because that's what I think the Zen Pro is. It's just a much stronger, well-rounded earphone. Maybe if you're being picky, you could complain that it lacks a bit of a wow factor, where again, I think the original Zen has that bass character that does give it that wow factor. But apart from that, like, those are pretty minor things I don't like about this thing. This is generally an earphone that I think is pretty freaking phenomenal to listen to. But how does it stack up to some other earphones? So let me pull in some other earphones real quick. Actually, let me give this the full roadie wrap so we can navigate these around the table. And as I pull them in, I will announce them and their prices. So, original Dunu Zen, sorry, not the original, Dunu Zen Pro, $900. The original Dunu Zen, $700. Moondrop S8, $700. And now we're gonna dip into a couple that are definitely cheaper, but I think kind of more comparable here. We've got the JVC FDX1. It's about $250. And because this is top of mind for a lot of folks, I want to bring this into for reference. This is the Moondrop Kato, about $190. And what these four have in common is that they are all single dynamic driver earphones. This one is definitely the difference, the black sheep, I suppose. This is an all balanced armature set, so this one's got 8 drivers per ear. These are all dynamic drivers. All right, how do we want to make this comparison? I guess I'll just start like I typically do with the tonality, and I got some feedback that people liked it when I ranked them based on tonality. So I will point out the caveats. Like some of these are a little bit hard to rank in terms of good, better, best, but I do have my preferences. So let's start. I would say let's start with the bottom. I think the original Dunu Zen probably has the weakest tuning of the bunch. Again, a little bit of a mild V-shaped sound signature, which is, that's not so bad. It's fairly warm in the mid bass, fairly forward in the upper mid range, and then the treble comes across a little bit dark. Honestly, it's kind of that dryness in the treble that I think probably hurts the original Zen the most, where again, this is all about its bass character, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the technicality section. But that's probably where I think in just purely in terms of tonality, that's where I put this. From there on, honestly, these are all four pretty good, but I do have preferences. So I'm gonna have to say the Kato is probably next. Again, I would describe this as a little bit of a mild V-shaped sound signature. Really strong bass quality, really good, really well-defined treble. The only reason this doesn't perform better is that these three up here are, versus these two, a lot more mid-range focused, and I tend to prefer a mid-range focus, so I would leave the Kato here in this position. Next up, I would probably go with the JVC FDX1, which tuning-wise it's fairly lean, bright version of neutral. I would say this is a very vocal forward sound signature, and you can tune it a little bit because there are some tuning nozzles, but you don't really change that character too much. This is generally a bright mid-range focused sound signature that I like a lot, but it does lack a little bit of body. And now that's leaving these two for the top, and I'm probably gonna cop out and just say like these are both about equals for me in terms of tonality, but they are on different sides of my target, right? So if my preference target is here, they're on either side of it, all right? So the Dunu Zen Pro, this is neutral with a little bit of mid bass. It's a little bit on the warm side, whereas here with the Moondrop S8, this is neutral, but it's a little bit on the lean, bright, and forward side. I think, honestly, just purely on tonality, I have a really hard time picking between these, but they are significantly different because they are on either side of my preference. So if you want the warmer tuned, slightly more laid back, that's the Zen Pro, although still I would describe both of these as based on neutral and mid-range focused. But if you want a little bit more bright mid-range focused or mid-range forward sound, I think the S8 does that. So that's how they rank up and compare in terms of tonality. Let's talk about them in terms of technicalities. And as I'm looking at my notes, honestly, this isn't going to move around too much. I will still probably leave the Dunu Zen down here in the bottom. Not that it's a bad performing earphone at all, honestly. The bass character on the original Zen is the thing that makes this thing really, frankly, pretty special to listen to. The bass on the original Zen right here, it's just got this physicality and this toughness to it that is really pretty addicting to listen to. I would say that apart from that though, the rest of the sound is it's fairly ordinary. It's, you know, certainly no slouch, but it's fairly ordinary. Next up, in terms of technical performance, I guess I'd probably put the Moondrop Kato. Honestly, this is for $190 single dynamic driver earphone. The technical performance on this is pretty standout. I wouldn't say it's, you know, necessarily the biggest staging IM or anything like that, but what it does really well is it has really nice incisive definition on the treble, and then it carries that to the bass as well. I think the bass here is not as dominant as the bass is here on the original Zen, but the bass here on the Kato honestly has almost as much physicality, which is pretty impressive. Okay, maybe I'm exaggerating. It doesn't have almost as much. This is really pretty standout there, but this does have a physicality to the bass that is better than, frankly, any of these other three. So if you want that physicality in the bass, the Kato and the Zen are kind of your picks, but you know me, bass isn't always my top priority. So while they are quite excellent there, they're still probably down here at the bottom. Next up, in terms of technical performance, honestly, I would probably have to say the new Dunu Zen Pro. It does sacrifice some of that bass character that I described that was quite here, but I think what the Zen Pro gains in exchange for that is just a lot stronger sense of that micro contrast again that I was describing, kind of that sense of detail and texture in the mid-range. I think the Zen Pro is really quite phenomenal with, and that's the thing that I think, you know, the FDX1, which is going to be my next place that's what I really love about this earphone specifically, is that quality of texture and a sense of detail. It does have maybe a little bit of a metallic timbre. It's got a little bit of a reputation for that, and I understand why based on what, you know, my listening experience is. But it's really, really quite standout in terms of that sense of texture that I like quite a bit. And I do think the Zen Pro is frankly not too far behind with a better tonality, and so that makes me really quite like this earphone. But in terms of technical performance, I still got to leave the Moondrop S8. I've kind of run out of room here. How did I do that last time? The Moondrop S8 would still be my standout, and you know, part of this is going to come down to the fact that this is a multi-BA set, and BA sets just kind of tend to do that sense of, it's got a little bit more of a wow factor. It's got, I think, the strongest sense of separation in the sounds. Just in the instruments, like it's got the biggest sense of stage and strongest imaging performance. That's really what the S8 is quite good at. And then the treble performance on the S8 is just almost flawless. I love the treble performance on this thing. Never harsh. Frankly, like, I don't know, these two, the Zens are probably the only two that ever hint at being a little bit harsh in the treble, but even then, like, all these honestly are pretty good treble performers. So there you go. That's my preferences in terms of technicalities. And then I guess we can end this with preferences and rankings in terms of form factor. I got to say the Kato and the FDX1, I would say they're no slouches or anything like that, but these are pretty good examples of single dynamic driver ergonomics, which is to say they generally are relatively small, they fit fine, they fit easy, nice easy ingress and egress, but fit security, not a strength of these earphones. I would say the FDX1 I actually had the worst fit security issues with until I fitted them with Moondrop's spring tips. As you can see here, I've kind of become a fanboy of their spring tips, so you see those on a lot of these earphones, but otherwise, yeah, these are, you know, they fit fine, fit security is okay. I would say that both the Zen and the Zen Pro, again, they are single dynamic driver earphones, so they're not super custom molded or anything like that, but versus these, I do have better fit security with both of the Zens, and to a noticeable degree. That just means I don't have to fiddle with them as much when I'm wearing them, right? These things plug in my ears. I don't have to reseat them and try to get a good seal. They plug and play easier than either of these two. But frankly, the Moondrop S8 is still, in my opinion, quite standout in terms of form factor and ergonomics. I mean, one, I think this thing is just gorgeous to look at. I mean, honestly, all these are pretty gorgeous in their own ways, but I am a sucker for a translucent acrylic design, but maybe even more to the point, it's just got this sort of semi-custom molded design that, for me, fits really, really nicely. Fits Like, it's easy for me to plug these in and get a seal right away. And then once I've got the seal, they fit and they stay put completely. So that is how I would describe, you know, how all these different earphones stack up. But this video is about the Dunu Zen Pro. And so ultimately, I got to give you guys a score on this earphone. So yeah, in conclusion, I mean, I think I did a decent job of describing how relatively small the changes are between this and the original Zen, but how in practice, the actual difference is actually quite large. Frankly, this is one of my favorite, if not my favorite, single dynamic driver earphones at this point. Is that worth $900? You got to make up your own mind for that. The one thing that I think is actually a little bit interesting about this is that Dunu told me they're not expecting to sell a ton of these. In fact, from what they told me, they've only manufactured 200 of these. Not that they're limiting it at 200, but that's kind of where they expect this thing to sell. So if you're interested in picking up the Dunu Zen Pro, you might be one of 200 people out there, which is kind of cool. But how does it score? So out of 5 stars, I'm going to give the Dunu Zen Pro a very, very solid 4 stars out of 5. I have a feeling this is going to be one of those earphones that I dip into even when I'm not reviewing it, because I like that neutral sound signature with a nice little bit of bass boost. And then again, it's got that sense of micro contrast and detail that I get and that I love about the FDX1, but it comes with it a warmer, fuller tonality that frankly I find more satisfying. So those are my thoughts here on the Dunu Zen Pro. If you're interested in checking this thing out, I do have links in the description. While you're down there, if you found this video helpful, if you liked it, if you're just having a good time, hit the like button down below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Ding the YouTube bell thingamajig. And I'll catch you on the next super review, unless you're here live, in which case, hang out and let's have a chat.